Well, I'd like to welcome our internet audience back to this year's academic lecture series focusing on the theme of disability in the ancient Middle East and Mediterranean. First, before I introduce our speaker for today, I'd like to read a brief statement from the Bade Museum. The Bade Museum is an institution dedicated to advancing knowledge of the archaeology and history of the ancient Levant. Over the course of a few years, we at the museum have come to realize that advancing such knowledge means reflecting on and engaging with perspectives that have been largely ignored by modern-day society, and as a result have been erased from mainstream historical narratives. The Bade Museum particularly welcomes scholars who are engaging with marginalized perspectives that contribute to creating better equity in scholarship and in society more broadly. This series, Disability in the Ancient Middle East and Mediterranean, provides a platform for research on the experiences of people with disabilities, whose voices have been frequently overlooked in the study of the ancient world. This program bridges past and present through study of disability in antiquity, its contemporary reception, accessibility, and its continuing impact today, contributing to a more nuanced, inclusive, and complete narrative of the past. Thank you for joining us. And it is my distinct pleasure today to introduce our speaker. Dr. Eric Harvey is a scholar of the ancient Middle East whose work focuses primarily on Mesopotamia and the Levant. His research areas include the political economy of creation and mythology, material processes in textual transmission, and disability as lived and imagined phenomenon in ancient societies. His research into blindness in the ancient Middle East has been supported by the American Council of Learned Societies, and his work expanding Braille access to ancient languages has been supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities. You can find out more about his research and activities at his website, which is www.blindscholar.com. Dr. Harvey's talk today is titled The Real Lives of Blind Mesopotamians. So Dr. Harvey, I'm very pleased to give the floor to you, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and thank you to the Bade Museum and to the Archaeological Research Facility for the opportunity to come here today and share my ideas. I'm excited for this lecture, and I hope you all find it interesting. As Aaron mentioned, my research in part has to do with disability and in particular blindness in the ancient Middle East. From Egypt up to Levant, to Anatolia, and over to Mesopotamia. And the lecture I am giving today is part of a broader project that I call Blindness Lived and Imagined in the Ancient Middle East, which I envision as a holistic reconceptualization of the cultural place of blindness as a multifaceted phenomenon in ancient Middle Eastern societies. And what I mean by a lived and imagined phenomenon should become more clear in the lecture as we move forward. But as part of this project, I wanted to share sort of a look into the lives, the real lives of blind Mesopotamians. And that is in other words, this would fit into the blindness lived section rather than blindness imagined. So whenever we study disability in the ancient world, we run across a very profound problem of sources. Of course, sources of information are a problem in any domain of the study of the ancient world, but with particular ramifications on the topic of disability. Some disabilities show up in the archaeological record in human remains, such as those dealing with differences of limbs or different skeletal differences, but many, like blindness, do not, as it deals almost always entirely with soft tissues that are lost and decomposed over time. Text is also a fraught source of information because up until the late 18th and really 19th centuries, our primary windows into the ancient world came through the classical texts of Greco-Roman antiquity and the Bible. Now, these are wonderful texts, but there is a massive survival bias. The texts that survived through to the modern era were those that were deemed to have literary merit and thus were deemed worthy of being copied and recopied over the centuries. So the portrayals of blind characters that we find in these texts occupy a region that I refer to as the sighted imaginary. That is, blind people as they exist in the minds and stories of largely sighted storytellers and copyists. I'm not saying, of course, that sighted people are incapable of writing or telling stories accurately about blind people. I'm just showing that the context in which these stories were told and copied were contexts in which blind people played little part and over which they had little control. Furthermore, because these are literary representations, we find that they are just as concerned with human pathos, with drama, with characterization, with metaphor and symbolism, as they are with anything having to do with the real lives of the living blind. If you read through a lot of classical sources and biblical sources, you could be forgiven for thinking that every blind person in antiquity was either a bard, like Homer pictured in this painting of Homer and his guide here, or a seer, or a beggar. So that is sort of the skewed and partial picture we get from representations in ancient literature. Unfortunately, for much of the intervening period between the ancient world and the modern era, we have not had a lot of access to what are called documentary sources. That is, those sources that were written and are contemporary with the events that they concern and can be seen to be documenting events of everyday life from a contemporary perspective. So here, enter Mesopotamian archaeology in the 18th and 19th centuries. Colonial explorers and archaeologists and treasure hunters traveled to the Middle East and began to unearth Mesopotamian texts, which, unlike linear scripts written on written on organic media that decompose much quicker, were written on tablets of clay and pieces of stone. And here we have, for example, a document from the South Palace of Nebuchadnezzar II, dating to the year 591 in Babylon, which conveys some very exciting information about expenditures of flour in the palace over the time period of about 2 months. Now, these are not the sort of things that get recopied generally. And so in contexts where writing was done on organic materials, they tended to decompose and be lost to time. In Mesopotamia, however, these records, which were kept by the tens and hundreds of thousands across different contexts and eras, were survived. And in fact, clay tends to actually get harder often when the city gets destroyed and burned to the ground. which is one of its more wonderful properties for the work of archaeology. So documentary sources take many forms and include things like receipts or lists of income and expenditures or work rosters, contracts, and letters. And all of these give us information that is much closer to the ground than the literary sources that have survived over the centuries. That's not to say, of course, that they're completely transparent and don't have their own interests and perspectives, but at the very least, we can be sure that, we can be uh, much more confident that a blind person included, for example, in a receipt or a work roster or a list of distributions of oil or flour, um, was a real individual labeled blind living at the time that the document was written. In other words, these documents give us connections to real lives, uh, untouched by the accretion of narrative elements that we find in literature. So I'm going to spend now some time going through archives of these materials and the sort of the nature of the archives and where we find blind people in them. And I'm going to start with the category of life and work, since a lot of these records are economic in nature, having to do either with laborers or the distributions of oil and flour to institutional dependents, that is, workers who were bound to a temple or palace. We get a lot of information about sort of their work positions and what sorts of support they received from the institutions they worked for. And this goes all the way back to sort of some of our earliest archives of writing. In the early dynastic period, which is roughly sort of the period where we get lots of writing, is roughly the middle third of the third millennium. And we find here quite a few mentions of blind people in economic records and administrative and accounting records. Uh, so this is still an archive that I'm working through in more detail. So I haven't read all of these texts, but if you do a cursory search for the Sumerian word Iginudu, which means a blind person, you find upwards of 420 references in the Electronic Pennsylvania Sumerian Dictionary. And a lot of these are in labor records. Most of these are attested in a number of occupations, including millers, water drawers, that is, people working in irrigation, gardening, and in field crops, and then musicians. There are also some artisans in the list, although I haven't gone through enough detail to see what sort of crafts they were producing in the early dynastic period. Moving forward, we get to the Ur III period, and the Ur III period is well known for putting bureaucratic administration on overdrive. In the Ur III period, in the cities primarily of Umma, Girsu, and Lagash, they really attempted to bring every aspect of the economy as far as they could under state control, and to meticulously track and record everything, even to the point of trying to forecast future crop yields or quotas from past information. A lot of the accounting that they started in the Ur III period is accounting on the level that economic historians usually credit to the Renaissance, because it is so precise and highly advanced in terms of its theory and practice. So we get a lot of records from the Earth 3 period. And in the Earth 3 period, uh, we have blindness described with a new term rather than igi nudu, which is a Sumerian compound from the word igi, eye, nu, not, and do to work. So someone whose eyes doesn't work. We get zia, which is etymologically related to a root for mutilation or destruction, although it's not clear from that whether anyone labeled as the or blind person um, was in fact blinded by injury, or if that included the naturally or congenitally blind at all. Um, this is a recent argument made by Wolfgang Heipel and supported by Shrader, Steinkeller, and others in terms of the understanding of the root zia, or the word zia, written usually with the sig 7 sign as blind in the Or3 corpus. So looking at the attestations in the Or3 period, we find like kind of a profound diversity, although we do find overrepresentation in a few occupations. So the most numerous occupation attested in Or3 documents is millers, that is, people working in milling houses grinding grain. This was done generally in sedentary and in corporate contexts. These were institutional mill houses. That number is very high, 148, largely because of one group of 140 millers who we're going to talk about in a little more detail later. But outside that, there are also, 8 or so other millers scattered throughout the economic records, more individually or scattered more broadly. The second most common occupation was a musician. And of those, we have 11, a mix of both male and female musicians. Plowmen, there's a team of 6 blind plowmen who are mentioned in a document. We have 2 ox drivers who are called blind, 2 dock workers, 2 fishers, 2 weaver women, 1 shepherd, 1 fuller, 1 groom, and 1 grass carrier, and of course, the old keeper of the mules of the god Ningirsu. So here we have, you can see there is not an even representation in all of the occupations here. There is a little bit more concentration in a few occupations that are generally associated with the blind and are also sedentary occupations that can be done largely while sort of sitting or standing still. There are also quite a few, I forgot to include them on the list, and I apologize. There are quite a few also of the water drawers, again, or people working in irrigation or water drawing work, drawing water out of canals or wells or rivers and spreading the water across the garden or field. As you've noticed, one of the most common occupations in both the early dynastic and Or3 periods are musicians. And this is something where we do get a strong connection between the lived experience of blindness and the literary representations. In the literature, we find quite a few bards and blind musicians, including Homer and Demodocus in the Greek literature. And as well as the famous blind harpist paintings from Egypt. And in Mesopotamia, we have blindness and music connected in the myth known as Enki and Ninmah, which I'll talk about a little bit more later if I have time. But in terms of blind musicians in ancient Mesopotamia, our best information actually comes from later than the 3rd period, the 3rd dynasty of Ur. It comes from the Old Babylonian period. And here on this slide, I have one of my favorite little texts, just because I find it so evocative and interesting, so interesting and elusive. we have this small text now in the University of Manchester Museum, on which we find the text, on the 18th day of Tibirum, the blind girl Sheena Nudum was brought before me to learn the art of music. I've written on this in several places because I just find it such a fascinating glimpse into a single moment in the life of a real person, a young woman who was experiencing a profound change in her life in the winter of 1667 BCE. And we don't know what happened to her before. We don't know what happened to her after. We don't know the the terms of her apprenticeship or education. We don't even know who is the person referring to themselves as me in this text, right? Who is the teacher? Or what is the institutional context of the education? There's so much we don't know, but this glimpse into this girl's life 3,500 years ago, I find fascinating in its elusiveness. Now, also in the Old Babylonian period, about 100 years before Shinanudum's time, we do have descriptions of the context of blind musicians, of one context in which blind musicians worked from the kingdom of Mari. The kingdom of Mari is in northern Mesopotamia, or modern Syria, on the west bank of the upper Euphrates. And it was a flourishing kingdom in its own right, up through the middle of the 18th century BCE, when it was conquered and destroyed by Hammurabi of Babylon. But in the period in which it was an independent kingdom, from the reigns of its last several kings, we have this extraordinary archive of administrative text and palace correspondence from Mari, from which we get not only some of those bare economic details that we got in the economic rosters and lists of the administrative state, but we find really the human side of living and working and navigating the politics of a palace, expressed in letters from various parties, from one to the other. And music was a huge part of palace life at Mari. At the beginning of the reign of Zimri-Lim, who was the last king of Mari, there were about 300 women who lived in the palace as dependents, and about a half of those were musicians. By the end of his reign, there were 600 women living in the palace, but we don't have good information on whether that proportion stayed the same as the absolute number of women grew. There are also 130 men working in musical occupations in the palace, although men tended to live off premises and so weren't included always in the ration and distribution of support lists. And so the distributions of material resources. So there may have been more male musicians even than this. So that's a lot of musicians, but how many of them were blind? And it's hard to tell, but we often get mentions in letters. I shouldn't say often, we sometimes get mentions in letters of blind musicians mentioned separately from the sighted musicians that they perform with. So, for example, there is this brilliant drama that plays itself out over a series of letters. And you can read about this in the work of Nell Ziegler, who has written on it wonderfully. But there was an elder director of music named Rishia, and then there was his young apprentice and upstart who was Ilshu Ibishu. And there was drama between them as Ilshu Ibishu's rising star and support from the king grated on Rishia and began to eclipse his star. And so you get these letters where Rishia is writing the king to complain that he is being treated unfairly, and Rishia is being privileged, or no, Ilshu Ibishu is being treated unfairly well. So you get this letter where he says, you took away my musicians from my ensemble, and you told me the lion does not plow, the lion obstructs the plowman. I have been the plowman getting good results in your palace, and now you call me the lion obstructing the plowman. You took away my musicians. Um, and in this one, I think he says, you took away the blind men from my musical ensemble. In other letters, you get them mentioned as, you moved uh, 18 musicians, including two blind female musicians, to the ensemble of Rashia out of my ensemble. So uh, it's hard to tell how many of these musicians in the Palace of Mari were blind, but it's clear that there were blind musicians and um, that they were sometimes numbered and counted differently from the sighted musicians. There's also an intriguing but also elusive text from Mari, a letter that seems to imply that either blind young blind young people were funneled into music, or that some young students were blinded prior to becoming musicians. This is a letter where it refers to two young boys whose eyes were put to sleep. And there's a lot of philological discussion over this letter in terms of whether that means that they were already blind and that they were, given some sort of medical treatment for aesthetic or medical purposes, or that they were blinded prior to becoming musicians. So there's some unclarity around the role of blindness in the Palace of Mari, but it also gives us sort of a human view into the context of music in a large palace institution. I'm not going to go through all of the other archives and corpora that I looked into because that would quickly get tedious. Save that for my book, and you can read through them at your leisure when that comes out in a number of years. Oh, but there are several archives and corpora also that have interesting sort of corroborative evidence with the earlier archives that we discussed, as well as some new and unusual sorts of findings. In the Middle Babylonian period, we find this archive around the city of Nippur of some of the lowest menial laborers in the society of the time, in which there are large work rosters that describe work groups and who the overseer is and who the workers are and any sorts of mitigating conditions they have. Many of those are identified as blind as well. And the city of Nuzi, which is closer to the Tigris in Mesopotamia. We also have mention of blind gardeners and blind musicians, as well as some other texts that give a little more flavor that we'll describe later. But also in Nuzi, there is a very interesting and unusual thing, which is a blind member of the upper class is named. And he is called a Rakib Narkabti, which means charioteer, but that doesn't mean he was actually a chariot driver. Rather, in Nuzi, the Rakib Narkabti were the upper class of the city of Nuzi, the highest general social class. We very rarely get upper class or aristocratic type folks identified as blind, I think largely because they were able to control their own representation in text and decide what was disclosed about them and what was not, in a way that menial and subordinated laborers were not. Also, as I showed you at the beginning, we have archives from the southern palace of Nebuchadnezzar II in Babylon in the early 6th century BCE, where again we find a lot of blind gardeners in particular. So that's more corroborative evidence that we have a lot of blind gardeners, musicians, and millers, as well as other occupations attested in a more scattered fashion. So that tells us about the life and work on a sort of bare bones detail kind of way. But that doesn't tell us much about the social position of blind people or how they navigated the social world of ancient Mesopotamia. That is, to what degree did they experience stigma or discrimination based on their disability? And this is something where we actually get very little information. In fact, one of the only texts I can find is this text from Nuzi in the Middle Babylonian period concerning it's a legal complaint brought by a young woman concerning all three parties involved in this legal complaint are enslaved to another woman named Tulpanea, whose private archive has survived substantially. So it gives us a lot of information of a private archive in Nuzi at the time. But Manuya, this young woman named Cassia, has been engaged or betrothed to a man named Manuya, and she wishes for that engagement to be dissolved. And she said, "Why have you engaged me to a blind Manuya?" So it's not 100% ironclad that her rejection of Manuya is based on his blindness, but it is the only personal characteristic named in the text that leads her to ask for a dissolution of this engagement and to be engaged to this other gentleman instead. So that's very little direct evidence of social stigma and discrimination. However, we do find that blindness is viewed negatively and pejoratively as degradation in another context, which is the context of violence and control. So I've brought here a couple of royal inscriptions from various kings and emperors throughout Mesopotamian history who have said various things about what they did to their conquered enemies. So, for example, here we have Shusen, who blinded the young men of the conquered land of Shamashki and gave them to the milling houses of Enlil and Ninlil and the other gods, and then also brought the women to the weaving houses. So here we have the conquered men of a conquered army blinded and taken as POWs and put to work in the mills. And we have here also women who are not blinded, but are also taken to work as POWs in the weaving houses associated with the temple. In the Akkadian king Naram Sin describes his general Ibhor Kish blinding the eyes of his enemies and shaving the slave marks into their heads. So here again, we have the connection of violence as a punishment meted out after military conquest and immediately feeding into sort of the disciplinary violence of captivity and enslavement. And in a very similar way, we have Shalmaneser I, who describes in one of his campaigns that he butchered their hordes, but left 14,400 of them alive and brought them into captivity. So looking at the number here, the extraordinary number 14,400, which is both extremely large and much too neat and tidy, being 120 squared, this does it's kind of obvious that this may not be completely precisely accurate, but may have more to do with Shalmaneser I trying to project complete and total imperial power in the absolute conquest of his enemies and their degradation and subordination to his imperial labor force. So here we have this connection between violent blinding as a punitive sort of violence after conquest, and also as a disciplinary form of violence that forms that feeds into a labor force and serves as a disabling act that actually immobilizes and decreases the chances of escape or revolt from prisoners of war. So, it's clear that this was going on some level, even though it may not have numbered in the tens of thousands as Shalmaneser I would have us. believe, but those 140 millers in the Ur III period that I mentioned before are also all described as Amorites, that is, foreigners. And so it is quite likely that these were prisoners of war who were blinded and then set to work in the mill houses. We also have some other evidence from the Hittites in the middle of the second millennium. I love talking about these just because they're two of my favorite letters in the Mesopotamian documentary record. The first letter is a request for a transfer of a group of blinded POWs. And saying, we sent for these POWs to be transferred. When are they going to make their way to the new location? And then the response letter, which is slightly later, writes back, and basically the message boils down to, yeah, those guys escaped and we don't know where they are. So I personally just love the idea that, blinding was used to, in a sense, prevent escape or revolt or insubordination. And yet we have this group of blinded POWs escaping into the Anatolian wilderness. And I like to imagine living lives of freedom and adventure out there on their own. Oh, there is also evidence of slavery and blindness coexisting and intermingling outside of the military realm. In Ur III, Umma, and Lagash, we have, for example, mentions of blind gardeners, upper class members of the city, procuring blind gardeners for work in their private gardens. And then in the famous reform documents of Urukagina, he mentions that he stopped people from kidnapping blind people off the street to work in their gardens. So we have not only participation in the existing commercial slave trade going on, but also the trafficking of free people into enslaved labor in the gardens, and a particular mention of the preferential targeting of blind people for that kind of trafficking. We also have contracts at Newsy where breach of contract, it says if you break this contract, you have to give the offended party to the contract one of your slaves. And OPS, it can't be a slave who is either blind or broken, meaning injured or disabled in another way. So here we have the sort of, even in the degrading context of human slavery, we have the further degrading comment in this contract that the blind enslaved people are not even worth as much as normal normate able-bodied slaves. So while we don't see the same levels of like explicit symbolic and metaphorical and social discrimination in Mesopotamian texts that are familiar from a lot of other texts, ancient and modern, we do see blindness used practically as a form of degradation, of punishment, of violence, of disablement. And so there was clearly stigma operating in that level as well. So what I hope to have conveyed in this process is a broader image of who the actual living blind were in the ancient world and the social positions they occupied. They were not all bards, seers, and beggars, but they filled a whole bunch of different occupations, from those that we expect, such as music, milling, those sorts of things, to ones that we don't expect, like dock workers and ox drivers, and occupations like that. I think there's also, it's worthwhile to consider the link between the lived and the imagined, between the documentary sources and the and then the literary representations. We see a lot of differences here between some of the classical literature, where blindness is as much about symbolism and metaphor as it is about the disability itself. And we're familiar with those from classical antiquity from Greece and Rome and from the Hebrew Bible and the Greek Bible. But what about Mesopotamian literature itself? And here we find something that is a little more representative of the things that we see in the documentary record. There are very few literary mythological representations of blindness in Mesopotamian literature, but the ones that we do have do kind of match up with the documentary record of what was going on the ground. So, for example, in the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, there is a scene in which Enki, the god Enki, disguises himself as a gardener to gain entrance to the house of a goddess in order to impregnate her. And as part of the disguise, he seems to also take on the appearance of a blind person, which, if that is what's going on in the text, reinforces the connection between blind people and gardening. Perhaps most famous and most developed the connection between blindness and music comes in the myth of Enki and Ninmah, which is a myth of human origins and the origins of the world order. But in one scene, the goddess Ninmah, who is a womb goddess who helped form humanity, at a drunken feast, challenges the god Enki to a challenge that she can create humans who are so abnormal, so deviant, so disabled, or so deformed that Enki can find no way for them to make their own living in the world. And she makes a bunch of different disabled people. And Enki, for each of them, finds a way for them to earn their daily bread. And of these, she makes one person who is blind. It says this person's eyes turn back the light. And Enki teaches this one the art of music and sets him up as the chief musician in the royal court. So we find even among blind people that many of them were occupied in menial labor in the bottom strata of society, but that is also true for most of the sighted people in ancient Mesopotamia. And we find also that in some cases, blind people were given positions that were not just positions where they could clearly contribute, but were positions with power, prestige and proximity to power. So I hope this has broadened your conception of the way blindness existed and functioned in the ancient world. And I will conclude there, and I will be happy to turn over to questions if anybody has any. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Harvey, for a really enlightening talk. Really appreciated learning so many new things about ancient Mesopotamia. There is a question and a comment from at least one viewer on YouTube. But prior to getting to that, I just wanted to let our audience know that today's talk is being recorded, as are all of our talks, and will be available at a later date on our YouTube channel. So if you weren't able to catch it live, let your friends know, and they can watch it later on YouTube. But getting to our first question, the participant, whose name is Noor Al-Samari, wonders if you have made any connections between your research to blind Iraqi Jewish musicians who were especially active from the 1930s to 1960s, of course, in the Common Era. And also, there were other Middle Eastern blind musicians outside of Iraq, she states, who played with the famous Egyptian singer Kulthum. So if you'd like to comment on that, that sense of modern parallels.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is that I have not, because that's sort of out of my time horizon. I would love, I mean, if you have information on those, I would love to hear about it. So feel free to email me. I'm always looking for more. I mean, the Mesopotamian textual record is so vast that I'm always looking for text. So if you happen upon a blind text or a text with a blind person in it, feel
Mhm.
free to send it to me. And that goes for other Iraqi or Levantine or Egyptian or Anatolian sources as well, even if they're not ancient. So I'm really interested in this. If there was like a movement of or a a group of blind musicians in Iraq, um, I'm very interested in hearing about that. In general, I think this connection between blindness and music is fascinating because it's one that you actually see in both the sort of the literary, the social construct of blindness as it exists in everybody's mind versus the actual empirical phenomenon of blindness. That you do see a connection between blindness and music. Um, and you see it everywhere. I mean, I've just found out. I see when people cite my work on in their writing on ancient China that there are and medieval Japan that blind
Mhm.
musicians were really important parts of the cultural um, framework in those contexts as well. I just found out one of my favorite bluegrass guitarists was blind, and I had no idea.
Oh,
So like it's just this is an interesting connection, and it's one that actually crosses the boundaries between that lived and imaginary uh, membrane, I guess. So thank you for that comment. I'll look into those, and please send me information if you have it.
and I'm wondering if you could just help out the audience by stating your email address.
Oh, yes. My email address is very easy to remember. It's eric@blindscholar.com. And if you forget it, just go to my website, which is blindscholar.com, and you can find it there. So I'm pretty easy to find on the internet.
Fantastic. So the that same viewer, Noor Al Samari, also has a comment. She adds, the first school for the blind in the Middle East was created by an Iraqi Jewish woman in Baghdad in 1929, and many of them became musicians. So there's another wonderful connection
And
between.
that's absolutely an institution that I would love to hear the history of. Uh, if no modern Iraqi historians have written it yet, somebody should.
Yeah, wonderful. So I hope you two can make connections through
Mhm.
email. Um, and let's see, Nick Veldhuis, a scholar from UC Berkeley,
Mhm.
asks, could you tell us something about the book that you mentioned briefly?
Absolutely. And thanks for the question. Yeah, this this whole project is going to build up and culminate in a book or perhaps a couple of books, depending on, I may put out one volume that is just a collocation of all of the texts that I've found mentioning blindness,
Mhm.
and then a text that is, there's definitely going to be a book that is a larger analytical synthesis of not only the Mesopotamian situation, but the situation regarding blindness across Mesopotamia, the Levant, the Hebrew Bible, um, and in Hebrew and Aramaic sources, and in Egypt. I probably won't go all the way into the Greek period because I think things change profoundly at that point. But what I'm going to do with the book is sort of take a deep analysis of this empirical approach to the documentary sources,
Mhm.
and then do an analysis of other genres of literature as well. For example, I have draft chapters on medical literature and legal literature,
Hmm.
um, omens and prayers and incantations, as well as narrative poetry and narrative prose. Um, including many of the famous sort of Hebrew biblical stories, right? The there's the classic tale of Samson who was blinded and set to work in a mill, which is something we see represented not only in royal inscriptions, but also in sort of the documentary sources as we saw. Um, and then we have, I was pointing out that Southern Palace archives of Nebuchadnezzar II, which
Mm,
mention there's a text that mentions the Judean king Jehoiachin receiving his allotment of oil in exile and captivity. And then, a few lines down, there's some blind gardeners
mm,
who are also receiving oil. And, from my perspective, I'm like, that's very neat, but I wish we had, a text that would mention the other king of Judah who was exiled, Zidkiyahu, because he was, according to the biblical text, blinded before being brought into captivity. I'm like, we have
right.
texts that reference the king and the blind people, but not the blind king, and I would love to see that. But all these connections that I also in the process, and this is something I've published on in the Journal for Biblical Literature, and I have an article in process for um, Religion Compass, having to do with the symbolism and metaphorical uses of blindness in Hebrew biblical texts,
Mm,
because I think that the way we often read blindness as a metaphor in Hebrew biblical texts is retrojected from theological
mm,
developments that happened long after those stories were written.
mm,
Um, and so, particularly, there's this pervasive metaphor of blindness as spiritual um, imperceptiveness or even obduracy or stubbornness.
mhm,
And I think that is very evident, very present, clearly in Christian writing, um, in the text of the New Testament, and then even developed much more clearly um, in later Christian writing. But when you look at the Hebrew biblical texts on their own terms and in the terms of the ancient Middle Eastern cultural context they're coming out of,
mhm,
that metaphor is not operative. Um,
mm,
the Hebrew biblical writers, I think, understood implicitly in a way that we have blurred
mm,
in modern Anglophone metaphorical constructions that uh, blaming someone morally using the language of disability is a category error, right? To
mm,
choose to disobey is a moral choice. To be blind is not a moral choice, right? So we
right.
often use blindness this way in modern Anglophone writing and speech to like describe a moral failure or wrongdoing or stubbornness or denial, all of these things that are choices, um, with a metaphor of a thing that is not a choice. And that's something you don't find in the Hebrew Bible itself. So there are those areas where I'm also sort of reconceptualizing the metaphorical and symbolic valences of blindness based on a reading of the documentary sources and other sorts of literary texts from Mesopotamia and the Levant and other areas as well. So yeah, there's going to be a lot in the book, and there are other publications coming out sort of leading up to it as I think through these things.
Wow, so fascinating. And I was just thinking to the Hebrew Bible where you have uh, well, at least two characters who hold major positions who are blind, right? So we have the
Mhm,
priest Eli and we have the prophet Ahijah. Um,
mhm,
so if one thinks about this in terms of social position or class, it totally supports your hypothesis, right?
mhm.
Because these are characters, um, again, whether literary or real, whatever that means, who hold elevated positions in the society, right? So
Yeah.
so they're not denigrated
Mhm.
characters. They are elevated. So,
Well, and those ones, I'm just finishing up an article on the four blind old men in the Bible, right? We have Jacob,
hmm,
and we have Isaac.
hmm,
Or I guess Isaac most famously, but most people forget that Jacob also became blind at his old age.
hmm,
Um, and then we have Eli and we have Ahia, right? And what's very interesting about those characters is that none of them are ever like the Hebrew word for blind, iver, is never used to describe any of them.
Oh,
they're
wow.
all used sort of these sort of like delicate circumlocutions, like
Mhm.
his eyes didn't work because he was old, right?
Mhm.
And so there's almost, when you're looking at these patriarchal figures, these esteemed figures who are in a privileged position by identity and by sort of their life position and achievement or whatever,
Mhm.
you get this reticence to ascribe to them the stigmatizing identity trait of blindness. So there's a lot interesting socially going on in those stories as well.
Fantastic. And do
Mhm.
you know where that article is going to be published?
Yes, I'm hoping. So I'm hoping I'm going to submit it to either JSO Tate or VT, and then I'm sorry, Journey for the Study of the Old Testament or
Thank
Vetus Testamentum, and then it's also been invited for inclusion in an edited volume by uh, Carol Myers and Alison Grusecki on aging and constructions of aging in the ancient Near East.
Fantastic. So I think we have one final question from our internet audience. Laura Heath Stout asks, how has ableism in Middle Eastern studies, archaeology, etc., shaped how these histories are or aren't discussed in the field?
I mean, I think in some of the ways that I've just described, right?
Mhm.
In terms of the it, the metaphor of blindness as a moral failure or shortcoming is an ableist metaphor.
Mhm. Mhm.
And the willingness or eagerness of people to read texts as using blindness in that metaphorical way, as opposed to different metaphorical ways, represents sort of an implicit ableist bias, right?
Mhm.
Um, and it's not, I mean, it's clearly much more muted. I'm thinking of this article I read by someone who studies Syriac late Christianity, Candace Buckner. She has this excellent article on the life of Afu, which is a no, a Coptic text, I think. She does Coptic Christianity. But she quotes John Chrysostom in there, who says, "The eyes are the source of wisdom, and those who have damaged eyes cannot know God." Right? Um, so that is an area where ableism in the metaphorical sphere
Mhm.
then turns into a feedback loop
Mm.
into ableism in the literal sphere of, or not literal, the embodied sphere, right? Where sort of you get the metaphorical use of blindness to mean spiritual imperceptiveness. And then
Mm.
you say, if blindness is a metaphor for spiritual imperceptiveness, then blind people must be completely spiritual and perceptive, right?
Mm.
Um, so I think um, in general, I find, I will say I didn't start out to be the blind scholar who studies blindness. I
Sure.
lost my sight in the middle of uh, as I was writing my doctoral dissertation.
Mhm.
Um, and as part of my, highly academic coping strategy, part of that change in my life, I just read a whole bunch of books on the theory of disability and blindness and memoirs and everything.
Mhm.
And after doing all of that theoretical and analytical reading, I go back and read a lot of writing on texts that include disability, um,
Mm.
many biblical, not all biblical, but it occurs to me that like a lot of the writing on disability texts has not been done with the level of depth or nuance that it deserves. So I think I there are some cases of explicit ableism, but mostly I find that it's just underdeveloped and like needs
Mhm.
some correctives in ancient Middle Eastern studies.
Well, good for you for filling those gaps and for correcting those misconceptions, right? One last actually question, but this is
Mhm.
also a wonderful compliment again from Nur Al Samarai, and she asks, "Are you giving any public talks in person anytime soon?"
I'm not scheduled for any. I mean, anybody can reach out to schedule talks with me if they like. But I'm And I've been, no, I have podcast interviews scheduled, but no public talks in person. And
Yeah.
most of my podcast interviews right now are based on my book that just came out, which is not about disability. So,
Okay, well, why don't you mention that the new book that is published?
yeah, it's a short book in the Cambridge Elements series. They're books of 30,000 words or less. So this one's like nicely readable in an afternoon. It's called Reading Creation Myths Economically in Ancient Mesopotamia and Israel. And it goes over the material and economic side of the rituals of divine service in ancient Mesopotamia and the southern Levant, and then also how the myths of human origins and creation reify a class structure that was built into um, the organizations of society
Mhm.
rhetorically and to some degree, um, materially, that was organized around those rituals of divine service and a model and an ideology of divine service. So it looks at the Mesopotamian myths of Atrahasis, which is my favorite myth, Enki and Ninmah, which is my second favorite, and Enuma Elish, which is also pretty great. And then written on the biblical side, there's a deep dive into the Garden of Eden and ensuing events.
Fantastic. Well, Dr. Eric Harvey, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with our internet audience. And as a way of signing off, I just want to remind everybody um, that we have our November talk in this important talk series coming up on the 6th. So again, it's, I believe, a Thursday, November 6th, when Mason Shrader will be delivering a lecture entitled Digging into Disability, How Experience Affects Theory. So I hope you can all join us in November and also join us in thanking today's speaker for enlightening us about the world of ancient Mesopotamia. So thank you all, and
Thank
to see you next month.